If necessary, yes, we will shoot down a plane. Or, of course, we already shot down a drone, if necessary. And this exactly comes back to what I just mentioned, that we will always assess the situation, assess the immediate threat the plane poses, and acting quickly and decisively is exactly what happened in these two cases. And I'm really proud of our fighter jet pilots doing this, and our commanders in contact with them, coordinating all these activities. Clearly, what the Russians are doing is not acceptable. If it is intentional or not, at least it is reckless. And it should stop, absolutely. And what they will see now over the last couple of weeks is that whatever happens, we are there. And it will not, as you've seen in the next statement, detract us from supporting Ukraine, if that is what they might be thinking they could achieve. I don't know what is in their minds. If it was intentional, again, we are still assessing that. We will also keep on supporting Ukraine with even more vigor and more determination.
Well, first, let's admit that Rutte's words were bravely spoken. He sounds like a man who is defiantly shaking his fist at the enemies of mankind and sort of reminding everybody that this fight will go on until evil has been vanquished. It's a lot of nonsense. It's horse dung. We've looked at this, and NATO looked at this. I'm talking about NATO headquarters and the military headquarters in Mons have looked at this whole allegation. The first thing that NATO concluded and said publicly was this was not an attack on NATO, okay? Ruled it out right off the bat. Well, if it's not an attack, what is it? Is it something along the lines that you described? Is this Ukrainians capturing electronically some of these unmanned aerial vehicles and directing them towards Poland or Lithuania? I have no idea. Did someone in Norway up near the Arctic Circle sight a Russian unmanned aerial vehicle on the edge of the air defense identification zone and conclude that it had strayed into their airspace? I have no idea. I do know that the jets that were launched didn't seem to have much success against these targets in the air because less than 20% of them were struck. And I know from someone on the ground in Poland who checked it carefully that the debris that fell on a house in central Poland was not from an unmanned aerial vehicle. It seems to have come from an unexploded munition launched by one of the jets. I think the whole thing is hot air. It's nonsense. But what's depressing about the whole thing is that this is one more last gasp as an effort to drag us, the United States, into a war with Russia, because that's what it's all about. These are little nations. They have armed forces. The Polish army, by the way, is very, very good. It's probably better than the other three armies, German, French, and British. But it's too small to make a dent. About the only thing they can do is deploy another 10 or 15,000 troops to the border with Belarus or Ukraine. But to launch a major operation, an offensive on the ground, they don't have the depth, they don't have the experience, they don't have the organizational construct to support it. All of this is just hot air. And I think it's getting hotter by the day because the position of the globalists who've been running the show in Europe is eroding very, very rapidly. The three amigos are all going to go down. They're not going to survive. And this Polish president, President Nawrocki, had better read the tea leaves, because the only intelligent thing he said since he became president was his announcement that under no circumstances would any Polish soldiers fight in Ukraine against Russia. And he noted that roughly 10,000 Poles were killed inside Ukrainian uniform for fighting against the Russians. Nobody has an appetite for that in Europe at all. So Rutte is full of hot air, but he's also dangerous because he creates the illusion that there's some readiness for war which doesn't exist. And this could easily result in an accident. Somebody somewhere along the line of contact, which is the eastern front of NATO, could suddenly come into contact accidentally with something that's Russian, and you have an incident, and the whole thing erupts into an all-out war. I mean, I hope not. So I think the rhetoric needs to cool off because it's all nonsense. It's not going to happen.
Well, if you talk about the rhetoric needing to cool off, it went in the opposite direction when it was the Polish foreign minister, Sikorski, who addressed the United Nations Security Council conference a couple of days ago, pointedly looked at his Russian counterpart and said, "You have been warned."
By signing the Hitler-Stalin Pact, you helped launch World War II, the bloodiest in history. By Sovietizing Central Europe, you caused the Cold War. Don't start another one. We are peaceful democracies who have studiously avoided actively joining your attempt to reconquer Ukraine. But we will not be intimidated. I have only one request to the Russian government. If another missile or aircraft enters our space without permission, deliberately or by mistake, and gets shot down and the wreckage falls on NATO territory, please don't come here to whine about it. You have been warned.
What do you make of that? That you have been warned? I mean, he seems pretty cocky.
It sounds like Anne Applebaum wrote those remarks for him. That's his wife, and she is a card-carrying globalist / neocon, sort of the modern equivalent of a Bolshevik. And she and Jack Keane, I'm sure, would like to get together with Sikorski and plan the next war. Now, on the positive side, I was delighted that he at least told the truth about the Second World War. Without Stalin and communism, you don't get a war. Without communism, there's no National Socialism. I mean, the chicken and the egg issue needs to be understood. And Stalin was quite happy to see the war launched by Germany against France and Great Britain, because he thought, much as FDR, by the way, that this would be another exercise in trench warfare and drag on and on and on. He hoped that it would grind down Germany so that he could strike from the east and overwhelm Germany, and the Allies would be stuck. And so we would make lots of money selling the Allies everything from spare parts, weapons, munitions, and food to the people in the field. So both FDR and Stalin miscalculated. The war was over in a month. They thought it was going to last for at least a year. But I'm glad to hear he mentioned that. But having said that, everything else is pure, unadulterated nonsense. You are warned. I'm sure everybody in Moscow is shaking in their boots. You know, what a ridiculous statement to make. But this is the sort of war rhetoric that you get out of these people. There is no comprehension of what they are talking about. Whatever they saw between 1941 and 1945 would shrink to insignificance next to the destruction and the loss of life that would ensue if these fools carried out their stated intention of provoking the Russians into a war. That's how serious this is.
Well, and that didn't seem to be lost on the Russians, because Ambassador Sikorski on the other side of that circle there, he also talked about the if not the origins, the consequences of World War II and what Russia did.
The Polish Prime Minister Tusk today recognized that not a single drone that was found contained explosives. Not a single one posed a threat to civilians. As for the Polish opposition, it clearly said this is a blatant provocation, the aim being to pull Poland into war. Primitive hatred for our country and an attempt to portray Russia as the main threat to pan-European security is, before our very eyes, becoming the only ideology of European states. They're trying their utmost to make the next generation forget the bitter experience of predecessors of today's Euro-integrators. For instance, the experience of Napoleon and Hitler, who suffered defeat at our country's hands, for which Europe paid a lengthy and painful price.
So if this is just a kind of a, he said, she said, and then one can be sounding cocky, then the other can sound cocky, which side has the ability to back up the words?
Russia. Russia has a battle-hardened military establishment. They've absolutely embraced the new paradigm, which is connecting ISR to strike systems and making it impossible for your enemy to move, to think, to do anything, and then using the maneuver forces they've got on the ground to exploit what the ISR strike creates in terms of opportunities on the battlefield. They've done that. We're a long way from that. We can get there. We have the technology, but we aren't thinking in those terms right now. The Europeans are woefully behind. So, again, this is all empty rhetoric. It is dangerous, though, for the reason that I mentioned earlier. These stupid, pointless statements designed to create the illusion of strength where there is none invites a response. And that's something we don't want. No one in their right mind wants a war with Russia. And the Russians certainly don't want a war with the West. If they were hell-bent for a war with the West, they'd have been on the Polish border a year and a half ago at the least, but they weren't interested in that. They're already sitting on most of the terrain that was historically Russian with a Russian population. They are willing to do business and come to an end of this thing, but they're not going to accept this sort of clownish neo-Nazi government in Kiev. They're not going to allow Ukraine to be a springboard for Western attack against Russia. So this is what Donald Trump listened to in Alaska and decided to ignore. And that's why nothing's happened. And I think President Putin and everybody in Moscow have said, we have no choice. We have to go forward and achieve our ultimate aims. Now, again, the good news for them is the situation in Europe is changing much more quickly than it is here. And remember, these are parliamentary governments. I was talking earlier today to a German. He said, "Oh, this is a terrible government we have. It could be 4 or 5 years, given our system before we get rid of it." I said, "That's not true. All you need is a no confidence vote. And the worse things get, the more frequent that's likely to be. So the sooner it happens, the better for you." He said, "Oh, yeah, that would be great if we could do it." It's interesting. The Europeans really can change things quickly. They can throw out these people and put in new governments very, very rapidly. They can't fix everything else, the financial situation, quickly, but they can certainly end this travesty of this stupidity in Ukraine and start spending the money at home where they need it. That's why you've got 800,000 people on the streets in London and several 100,000 people on the streets in Paris. And eventually you're going to see the same thing in Germany, because nobody wants anything to do with this. But, remember, Rutte and Merz and Starmer and Macron, they are part of the graduating class of globalists that are determined to force the world into something it doesn't want. A world without borders, a world without effective management of its own economy, a world without industry and scientific development, a world of poverty and despair with a small ruling elite consisting of themselves telling everybody else how to live. A surveillance state where they're in charge and no one else is. All of this has got to go away. It will.
And to your point, I mean, we just saw a vote of no confidence in Paris just less than a month ago. So that obviously is something that could happen at any time, and Germany's moving in that direction. One of the things that may not help or may actually exacerbate some of these things is that the Russian view on this, they've been, pretty famously have the patience of Job about how they have not responded to a lot of things. But one wonders if there's a limit to the Russian patience. Dmitry Peskov, the statement for the spokesman for the Kremlin, said this morning that, look, we got to recognize, or we do recognize, we're effectively already at war with NATO.
NATO is fighting with Russia. This is obvious and needs no additional proof. NATO is de facto involved in this war. NATO is providing direct and indirect support to the Kiev regime. This is why it can be said with absolute certainty that NATO is fighting against Russia.
And I'm sorry, that was actually a week ago. That's not the comment he made this morning. But obviously, it's still the statement for the way the Kremlin sees this. Is he being hyperbolic, or I mean, NATO is helping the Ukraine side, but he says direct and indirect.
No, I think it's very accurate. And again, this goes back to: are we dealing with Trump 2 or Biden 2? And my view is that if you're looking at the situation in Ukraine or the Middle East, it's Biden 2. Whatever President Trump promised, whatever he argued for, whatever he supported before he was elected, has been completely displaced by Biden policies. In fact, you could argue that he's doubled down on all the failed policies and made matters that much worse. So the opportunity for normalization of relations with Moscow, which he said is something that he really wanted back in January and February, has vanished. There's no longer any interest in it. It's very sad. So you have to conclude, yes, this is NATO, but remember, without the United States, NATO doesn't amount to much. That's the bottom line. And if we're selling to the Europeans sophisticated missiles and other technologies of the military, the Russians aren't fooled. They know where it's coming from and they know who's supporting it. So he's effectively correct. Now, your question is, if you're a Russian, how long do you put up with this? Well, there are two answers. One is they've won militarily on the ground, and there is no rush at this point. There's no reason to cross the Dnieper and overrun Western Ukraine. They don't want to do it. They want to sort that out another way. On the other hand, there are undoubtedly voices in Moscow warning this could get a lot worse if we don't stop it now. So I don't know which side you fall down on in Moscow. I think President Putin has exercised restraint and patience, and it's paid off. And it's going to pay off handsomely over the next 6 months, because I think that's going to be the end of the globalist regimes in the West. When they're gone and the nationalists take over, that's when you get peace in Ukraine, because they're not going to go to war. And that, again, is why Orban was saying just very recently, don't waste your time going to Washington. Washington isn't going to solve our problems. Washington has no interest in solving our problem being the war in eastern Ukraine. Look at Trump. Look what he's doing. We got to go to Moscow. Moscow is just as interested in an end to this thing as we are. And the Europeans really are interested in it, not necessarily the globalists, because the day that they no longer fight, the day that they admit that this thing can end and that they were wrong to begin with, they had no business supporting this regime and encouraging the worst aspects of it in a war, they're finished. They're going to have to be removed before anybody admits that, I'm afraid.
Well, you mentioned a minute ago that if Jack Keane had his way, it turns out that he is lobbying for a way. And now he's not in the administration, but he's obviously a very influential person, definitely a part of this so-called elite that loves war and has been advocating for a continuation of this. But he actually said, and I'm wondering to what extent you think this plays into the Putin calculation for how much longer patience is in order, or should they escalate and ramp things up? Because Jack Keane this morning was referring, first of all, to something happened in Poland with this alleged penetration happened with the drones, and they activated Article 4. He went on television this morning and said, maybe we should be looking at Article 5.
They want Poland to conclude that what they need to do is shore up their defenses better and reduce the resources and support for Ukraine, because they're threatening them. Oh. And it's not a hybrid war. These are conventional tactics being used. Russia has the capability to deliver 1,000 drones flying into Ukrainian airspace and into Polish airspace. And it's a fact that Poland would not be able to stop all those drones based on the interceptors that they have and the $1 million interceptors that they are to shoot down a $10,000 drone that has the capability of killing people. Wake up. This is not a hybrid war. This is Russia testing you, and the next step could be quite something significant. And NATO has got to come together and not talk about Article 4, talk about Article 5.
What the hell, man? Article 5, I mean, that's like saying, let's get ready to go to war with Russia. And he's actually saying that we need to be worried about Russia attacking us. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, that's ridiculous. But let's go back to something he said, which is a very important insight. He said, let's face it, the Russians could launch 1,000 unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, armed and otherwise, into Poland. He's right. They could. And Poland can't possibly shoot them down. He's right. They can't. So if that's in fact true, why the hell are you talking about going to war? I mean, what a dumb idea. If you're already telling everybody that there's a capability gap and the Russians hold the high ground, they have escalation dominance, why would you want to risk a war? It makes no sense at all. The other thing is we got to go back to this Article 5, and if you read it carefully in the NATO treaty, Article 5 does not result in an automatic commitment to conflict against anybody. It commits everybody to have a meeting, after which the various national representatives have to go back to their respective countries, and their respective parliaments have to vote on whether or not they will fight. That's all. So this notion that Article 5 is a silver bullet and it commits everybody to automatic conflict, which apparently is something that General Keane and Petraeus and everybody else would like to see, is simply inaccurate, and it's wrong. I think there should be one more comment that he should reinforce if he gets a chance to tell the American people anything. And that is that all of these intercontinental ballistic missiles that exist in the Russian arsenal, a few now in China and ours for that matter, but we're worried about the ones in Russia, frankly, they are hypersonic. We can't shoot them down. So you're living in an event, in a setting where if you push this envelope and you insist on escalation, the escalation you get will be terminal because you can't shoot it down. It's sort of the same comment about Poland, only we're elevating it now to an intercontinental level. I mean, these things need to be stated. If people understand this, they will draw back in horror. And they will say, wait a minute, what does this general want? What's he arguing for? This man's lost his mind. Nobody will vote for that. Nobody wants that. Nobody supports that. And that's really what's at the heart of this. You don't go into a conflict without some relative confidence that you can win it. If you can't win it, avoid it. And then get to work to build yourself up to the point where if it should ever happen in the future, you could respond with some measure of confidence. We did that. That's the Cold War. We did that, certainly from the 50s all the way up into the late 80s. But do we need to do that now? That's the question. The Russians have had plenty of opportunity to inflict enormous damage, and they have not done it. They have done everything in their power to contain this conflict and keep it in eastern Ukraine. They have only struck west of the river because they had to weaken the logistical infrastructure, the productivity, and the manpower pool. So wake up. All these people need to go away. We need to replace all of them immediately because war is the last thing we need in Europe. It would finish Western civilization forever.
It would, but I just guess, especially, the likes of Jack Keane, the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, huge money is made a lot of this on this, whole ramping up. I mean, he literally would lose money, and all of these folks that you talk about, this global elite, I mean, they would lose money if we went into a position of peace. And unfortunately, they seem to hold so much sway, even though what they say is irrational and many times just flat out illogical. And yet they still keep getting the mic put in front of their press. Is there any way to bypass that to get to the sanity that most people, I think, recognize?
It's very hard in Europe right now, particularly in Germany, France, and Great Britain, to express an opinion that contradicts conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom is the narrative spun up by MI6 and CIA or Mossad, and then launched day in and day out every day to Germans and Frenchmen and Britons, telling them that they live in this very dangerous environment, and the only answer to it is to provoke a war. I mean, literally. You've got it. All you can do is say exactly what I did. Remember, we have this study that was done by NATO last year, and I think it was quoted in RUSI in London, and it said that NATO can only protect roughly 5% of its territory from air and missile attack. Well, that situation hasn't changed. You got to go back and look at a different world that existed in 1942, 43, 44, and 45, when we and the British, because the Russians weren't involved in it, the massive air campaign of bombing of Germany, we lost 18,000 bombers. And that was to a far less sophisticated air defense, but the Germans made the most of what they had, and it was very lethal. We lost, more men in the, the 8th Air Force than we lost in the entire Marine Corps during World War II. How did we lose them? We lost them trying to penetrate German air defenses. those losses, that kind of human sacrifice, as well as material loss, has to be understood, because it will happen on steroids today, because technology is raced ahead and our vulnerability is greater now than it ever was then. But, you know, it's hard to make that argument in Europe because they never hear it.